Imagine the winter palace halls echoing with panicked footsteps, courtiers whispering about protests, gunfire, and rumors of revolution. And standing at the center of it all is a man frozen by destiny, Nicholas II, the final ruler of an empire collapsing under its own weight. But what if, in this moment, he chose differently? What if a single decision, a single yes instead of no, a single act of courage instead of hesitation, shattered the rise of the faction that would one day evolve into the blood-soaked force known as the Bolsheviks? What if the horrors, the purges, the engineered famines, and the ideological killings never happened? What if the world never witnessed the deaths of over 60 million men, women, and children across the territories later ruled by the Soviet Union? Tonight, we explore the chilling alternate history where the 20th century turns on its axis, and where one man's lost decision could have erased an era of genocide. If you want the full payoff, the exact moment the world could have changed, watch this video until the end. Welcome to Chronicle History, where we walk through the shadows of the past to uncover the betrayals, murders, and forgotten decisions that shaped our world. If you're new here, consider joining us on this journey. Before we explore what could have happened, we must confront what did. Because the revolutionary faction that would later transform into the Soviet Union did not merely seize power, it reshaped the concept of human suffering itself. The movement led by the Bolsheviks unleashed a torrent of violence across the former Russian Empire, a storm of engineered famine, mass shootings, political purges, forced labor, and state-sanctioned terror. What followed was not just a regime change, it was an ideological reprogramming of society through blood. The new state targeted those it believed threatened its control: priests, monks, and entire Christian communities who refused to abandon their faith, scientists, professors, writers, and thinkers capable of challenging the new order, and rural families caught between starvation and forced requisition policies so brutal that entire regions collapsed into famine. In places where grain was seized faster than it could be grown, where local resistance was crushed without mercy, starvation became so absolute that eyewitnesses reported cannibalism in famine zones. Not out of savagery, but out of a level of desperation no human being should ever face. And behind this machinery of terror were not just ideological leaders, but networks of foreign financiers and political actors who supported revolutionary destabilization across Europe for strategic gain. Not out of ethnicity, but out of ambition, ideology, and geopolitical opportunity. The birth of the new regime was not spontaneous. It was funded, calculated, and accelerated by groups that viewed a collapsed monarchy as the perfect vacuum to exploit. Millions perished as the old world burned. But all of it, the Red Terror, the Civil War, the secret police, the crushing of dissent, stemmed from a moment in time when one man could have prevented the storm entirely. A moment when a single decision by Nicholas II might have sealed the cracks before they split open the earth beneath an empire. To understand the one action he should have taken, we must peel back the layers of fate, step into the corridors of power, and expose the fatal flaw at the core of the monarchy. But first, we must ask, why did everything fall apart so quickly? Why did the foundations of one of the world's largest empires crumble almost overnight? And that opens our first loop, the weakness that made catastrophe inevitable. The greatest tragedy of Nicholas II was not malice, but fragility. History expected a lion to lead one of the largest empires on earth. Instead, it received a gentle, sheltered man with a crown that weighed more than he could bear. He inherited an empire bruised by inequality, unrest, and industrial growing pains. What he needed was iron. What he possessed was hesitation. His court was filled with sycophants, terrified of honesty. His ministers were divided, corrupt, or incompetent. And his worldview remained locked in the past, even as the 20th century thundered toward him with demands for change. Meanwhile, revolutionaries whispered beneath the floorboards of the empire. Groups inspired by radical new ideologies, sharpened by writers and thinkers like Vladimir Lenin, were forming cells, printing pamphlets, and sowing the seeds of rebellion. Their ideas were still fragile, still scattered, still vulnerable. But Nicholas did not move. He watched the early Marxist groups grow, and yet he did nothing. He could have cracked down on their networks while they were weak. He could have ordered the arrest of their underground leaders before they became symbols of rebellion. He could have confronted the financiers, political actors, and opportunists, both foreign and domestic, who were happy to fuel instability for their own gain. Instead, he allowed corruption to metastasize through his empire, including within financial circles whose loyalties lay anywhere except with the throne. His failure to act decisively didn't just give the revolutionaries room to breathe, it gave them room to flourish. Then came the catastrophe that shattered the last remaining pillars of stability, World War I. Nicholas plunged the empire into a conflict it was neither ready to fight nor capable of sustaining. It was a decision driven by pride and desperation. A gamble he thought would unite the nation. Instead, it drained its lifeblood. The army starved. The people starved. The economy collapsed under the weight of a war machine it could no longer feed. And as the nation suffered, Nicholas allowed a single mystic, Rasputin, to seep into the deepest chambers of royal influence. His presence, his sway over the imperial family, turned the monarchy into a spectacle of weakness. The people whispered, the nobility plotted. The aura of divine authority fractured. By failing to build stronger alliances abroad, by failing to root out corruption, by failing to suppress a radical movement while it was still in its infancy, Nicholas let the foundations of his empire rot away beneath him. And yet, here is the haunting truth. There was a moment, a perfect, fragile moment, when he could have changed everything. A moment when one decisive action could have cut the roots of the revolutionary movement before it ever grew teeth. A moment that history forgot, but we are about to reopen. Let's open that loop. History is full of crossroads, but some crossroads hold the fate of continents. For Nicholas II, that moment emerged not in 1917 when everything was on fire, but a full 12 years earlier, before the 1905 revolution, when the empire was already cracking but not yet broken. Russia wasn't healthy, but it wasn't doomed. Not yet. At that moment, Nicholas had three clear paths before him, three decisions that could have redirected the entire century. Option one was the simplest and the most ignored. He could have approved full constitutional reforms, turning the rotting autocracy into a stable constitutional monarchy like the United Kingdom. This wasn't fantasy. Russian liberals in the early 1900s weren't calling for revolution. They were begging for stability. If Nicholas had legalized political parties, empowered civic institutions, and allowed the rule of law to take root, the pressure in the streets would have dropped overnight. Most Russians didn't want blood. They wanted dignity, fairness, and the right to exist without a boot on their neck. A constitution would have weakened the radicals and strengthened the moderates, giving Russia a future where reform happened in debates, not barricades. Option two was political, but powerful. Nicholas could have empowered the Duma, granting it real authority, instead of reducing it to a decorative toy he could dissolve whenever it pleased him. A strong Duma would have absorbed public anger like a shock absorber, redirecting revolutionary energy away from violence and into politics. Imagine a Russia where peasants and industrial workers knew they actually had a voice. Imagine a system where ministers could be held accountable instead of operating like medieval lords. Instead, Nicholas strangled every Duma that disagreed with him, reinforcing the belief that peaceful change was impossible. Option three was the harshest, but the most obvious. He could have dismantled radical cells early, long before they found structure, funding, or leadership. Groups like the Bolsheviks were tiny in the early 1900s, isolated, ideological pockets with no mass support. A focused crackdown on extremist networks before they metastasized could have prevented the rise of the men who would later orchestrate massacres, famines, purges, and the machinery of genocide. Russia didn't need mass repression. It needed targeted action. Instead, Nicholas relied on incompetent secret police, inconsistent policies, and a delusional belief that revolutionaries were too marginal to matter. And underlying all of this was a fourth, unspoken option, one Nicholas never even acknowledged. He could have reeled in the corrupt banking elites, the oligarchic financiers whose bigotry, predatory lending, and political manipulation were inflaming urban rage. These wealthy power brokers fueled inequality, bought influence, and openly mocked the suffering of the poor. If Nicholas had confronted them, cleaned up corruption, regulated financial abuses, and punished the parasitic class that was bleeding Russia dry, he could have taken the revolutionary narrative straight out of Bolshevik hands. Any one of these choices could have drained the poison building inside the empire. But Nicholas chose none of them. He clung to autocracy, dismissed reformers, empowered the corrupt, and underestimated the radicals who were quietly preparing to reshape the world in blood. And this brings us to the heart of the video, the one decision that would have altered everything. Stay with me. Here is the uncomfortable truth historians whisper behind closed doors. If Nicholas II had embraced a full constitutional monarchy around 1905, the Bolsheviks might never have risen. Not half measures, not symbolic gestures, not the shallow constitution he reluctantly signed and immediately undermined. No, a genuine transformation of governance, where authority was shared, accountability enforced, and reform visible to every corner of the empire. Why would this have worked? Because it would have cut the revolutionary appeal at its root. Radical ideologies, already infiltrating Russia from abroad, thrived on the perception that the monarchy was corrupt, distant, and hostile to the common people. By establishing a constitutional monarchy, Nicholas could have neutralized these foreign ideological incursions. He could have published clear policies and memos affirming the empire's commitment to protecting religious communities, including the Orthodox Church and Christian populations, while openly rejecting any propaganda that sought to incite division or violence. By addressing misinformation early, he could have denied radicals the narratives they used to recruit followers. A real reform would also have starved the revolutionaries of their most effective tool: fear. Workers, peasants, and intellectuals would have had a peaceful legal avenue to express grievances. Moderate reformists would have rallied behind the monarchy instead of drifting into the arms of extremist movements. A constitutional monarchy could have created a society where debate replaced barricades, pamphlets replaced bullets, and persuasion replaced terror. At the same time, Nicholas could have systematically targeted the foreign and domestic financiers exploiting unrest. By regulating funding and exposing ideological agitators, he could have reduced the influence of radicals imported from abroad. In effect, he could have sealed the cracks in Russian society before they became chasms, cutting off Lenin and his allies before they found the leverage to spark revolution. A constitutional transformation would not have just reshaped politics. It would have reshaped the very culture of the empire. It would have turned Russia into something resembling the United Kingdom, an evolving monarchy with a loyal populace, rather than a powder keg for ideology and propaganda to ferment unchecked. This was the move, the only move, one decisive action that could have crushed extremism before it became a monster. But Nicholas refused. He clung to autocracy, trusting outdated notions of divine right and fearing any loss of absolute authority. He underestimated the momentum of revolutionary ideas, ignored the warnings from his own advisors, and left the empire vulnerable to propaganda that sowed fear and division. Which brings us to the question that haunts historians and storytellers alike. Why didn't he do it? The answer lies not in external enemies, but in the paralysis of the man himself. His fear, his indecision, and the false security of tradition. And it is this hesitation, the choice not to act, that opened the doors to the violence, famine, and terror that would soon engulf millions of lives. The next chapter peels back the layers of that inaction, revealing the forces Nicholas II failed to confront and the devastating consequences that followed. Nicholas II was a prisoner long before the Bolsheviks ever took him captive, not by chains, not by force, but by the invisible shackles of his own mind. He was imprisoned by an unshakable belief in divine autocracy, the conviction that his authority came from God alone, and that questioning his rule was heresy. Every reform seemed like blasphemy. Every concession was weakness. Every warning from advisors was ignored because it challenged the sacred order he could not fathom bending. He was trapped by a paralyzing fear of looking weak, a fear that clouded judgment in the council chambers and on the battlefield. Nicholas could not allow himself to appear vulnerable, Yet his indecision made him more vulnerable than any soldier or revolutionary could exploit. He carried a worldview inherited from ancestors who had ruled centuries ago, in times quieter, simpler, and far removed from the industrialized, restless Russia of the 20th century. The old strategies no longer worked. The old authority no longer commanded respect. But he could not abandon them. And then there were the advisors, men who whispered doom at every turn, men who cloaked fear as wisdom, men who convinced him that any change meant destruction. Surrounded by echoes of his own insecurities, Nicholas became incapable of action. Yet there was another, far more personal chain holding him captive, the fragile health of his only son, Alexei Nikolaevich. The boy suffered from hemophilia, a condition that turned every minor injury into a potential death sentence. Nicholas, consumed by fear for his son, allowed an obvious charlatan, Rasputin, to worm his way into the inner sanctum of the imperial family. Rasputin's influence over Alexandra, Nicholas's wife, and his access to medical and political decisions weakened the monarchy in the eyes of the people, making the Tsar appear feeble, indecisive, and easily manipulated. Nicholas could not face the truth. He was already weak. His empire was crumbling, his army demoralized, his advisors corrupt or paralyzed with fear, and his family's private vulnerability now spilled into public weakness. Every day he hesitated. The radical networks he had ignored grew stronger. Every time he deferred action, the empire slipped further from his grasp. He believed that reform would destroy the empire, yet it was his refusal to reform that would ignite its collapse. Locked inside a cage of duty, faith, fear, and love for his son, Nicholas II did nothing when he still had the power to act. And so the question looms: what might have happened if Nicholas had broken free from the shackles of his own mind? If he had acted decisively, used his authority wisely, and confronted both internal corruption and external ideological threats, the path of history might have turned sharply away from blood and catastrophe. This is the loop we are about to open next, a vision of what could have been if one man had found the courage he never possessed. Before we step into the alternate timeline, the Russia that could have been, take a moment to like this video if you're enjoying this deep dive into forgotten turning points. Subscribe and ring the bell so you won't miss the next episode, where we uncover the betrayals, murders, and scandals that shaped history's darkest hours. Now, let's step into the world where Nicholas II said yes to change. Imagine a Russia where Nicholas II finally acts. The one decision he avoided, embracing a genuine constitutional monarchy, reshapes the empire before it cracks. In this alternate timeline, the Duma transforms from a powerless figurehead into a dynamic political institution capable of mediating tensions and addressing grievances. It becomes the bridge between the Tsar and the people, a structure strong enough to absorb anger and ambition before they erupt into violence. Workers, once silent or forced into underground movements, gain representation. Their struggles, once ignored, now have a voice in shaping policy. Peasants, long at the mercy of landlords and corrupt officials, finally have an outlet, a legal and visible path to participate in governance. Extremism loses its audience when everyday concerns are addressed, when daily lives improve, and when hope replaces despair. The monarchy itself transforms. No longer oppressive and feared, it becomes a symbol of unity, a stabilizing force rather than a lightning rod for rage. Loyalty is earned, not demanded. The royal family, careful yet courageous, demonstrates that authority and reform can coexist. Citizens begin to trust in institutions instead of revolutionary promises. Revolutionary literature, the pamphlets, manifestos, and fiery newspapers that once seduced young radicals, loses its edge. Its arguments no longer resonate because the moderate majority now sees change as possible within the system. Radical thinkers remain, but they are reduced to the fringes, speaking to small groups rather than orchestrating mass upheaval. And perhaps most crucially, the faction led by Vladimir Lenin never becomes a credible threat. Without the desperation of a disillusioned populace, without corruption and chaos to exploit, Lenin's promises of revolution fall on ears that already feel heard. His movement is isolated, fragmented, and irrelevant. Marxist cells that once seemed poised to topple an empire are now nothing more than marginal clubs, annoyances rather than engines of state-shattering terror. No February Revolution, no October Uprising, no Red Terror, no purges, famines, or engineered famines. The storm that swept through the empire, consuming millions of lives, dissipates before it ever breaks. But the consequences extend far beyond Russia. A stable empire in the heart of Eurasia changes the balance of power across Europe. Without Bolshevik Russia, the post-World War I treaties are rewritten. The ideological ripples of the 20th century, communist revolutions, the Cold War, the spread of totalitarian regimes are altered or delayed. Nations once terrified by the specter of radical socialism now find themselves negotiating with a Russia that reforms rather than collapses. All of this traces back to one moment, one decision, one act of courage that Nicholas II never took. And yet, while we can imagine this world, history went another way. The next chapter peels back the consequences of that failure, the cascade of events that transformed hesitation into horror. Before we continue, take a moment. If you're fascinated by these alternate histories, like this video, subscribe to Chronicle History and turn on the notification bell. We're just scratching the surface of the world that could have been. The next loop asks the most haunting question of all. What might have happened globally if the storm of Russian extremism never occurred? If Nicholas II had made that one choice, the world we know would look unrecognizable. The Soviet Union would never have existed. The ideological and political vacuum created by its rise, so central to the tragedies of the 20th century, would have been filled by reform, negotiation, and incremental progress rather than terror. Eastern Europe, instead of being plunged behind the Iron Curtain, would have developed under far more autonomous, moderate governments. National movements in Poland, the Baltic states, and even Ukraine might have flourished without the shadow of communist occupation, allowing societies to modernize without the crushing grip of ideological repression. China, too, would have felt the ripple. The fledgling communist movement there relied heavily on inspiration and tactical guidance from Moscow. Without a revolutionary Russia to serve as a blueprint, Mao Zedong would have faced a far steeper struggle to unify and radicalize China. The shape of East Asia in the 20th century, its wars, its revolutions, its alignment in global conflicts, would have been profoundly altered. Even the Cold War, with its nuclear standoffs, espionage, and proxy wars, would have been unrecognizable. There would have been no ideological adversary looming across the European plains. The United States and its allies would have confronted different geopolitical threats, and the global arms race might never have spiraled to the terrifying heights we remember. And the fate of Germany under Adolf Hitler would have shifted dramatically. Without the specter of a communist East, Hitler's rise might still occur, fueled by the Treaty of Versailles and domestic resentment, but his strategic calculations would be different. The absence of a Soviet Union on Germany's Eastern Front could have prevented the brutal multi-front warfare that decimated both sides. Perhaps the war would have ended sooner, or taken a drastically altered path, one that spared millions of lives across Europe. Tens of millions of human beings who perished in ideological purges, forced labor, famine, and civil conflict would have lived full lives. Entire generations, families, scholars, artisans, and children would have contributed to societies that grew in peace rather than in fear. The cultural, technological, and economic potential lost to history would have been staggering. Even World War II, inevitable in some form due to unresolved tensions and territorial ambitions, would have unfolded differently. Without a powerful communist state poised to claim influence in Eastern Europe, alliances shift. The post-war world, from borders to political ideologies, would have been unrecognizable. Nations that once trembled under the weight of ideology could have rebuilt under more moderate, stable systems. One decision by one man, Nicholas II, could have rewritten the fate of nations, millions of lives, and the very structure of the 20th century itself. But the reason this alternate timeline is so haunting is because Nicholas II himself realized the truth far too late. The empire had already crumbled, the radicals had already risen, and the chance to change history had slipped through his trembling hands. And that realization, the knowledge of what might have been, is the next loop we open. The haunting consequences of indecision and the human cost of hesitation. Revolutions do not rise alone. They rise when vultures circle. And around the collapsing edifice of the Russian Empire, long before open guns and barricades, dark money and foreign intrigue gathered like storm clouds. Behind the scenes, foreign powers and financiers quietly poured funds into radical movements, the same radicals whose pamphlets and promises would one day bathe Russia in blood. Among the names repeatedly cited in historical and controversial accounts are Alexander Parvus, also known as Helpfand, who allegedly worked as a key intermediary between Germany and the revolutionary faction. Parvus is recorded to have met with German officials in 1915, proposing financial and logistical support for subversive activity within Russia. According to those same accounts, the German government under the Kaiser viewed destabilizing Russia, its wartime enemy, as a strategic necessity. Through Parvus, millions of German marks were funneled to radical groups aiming to undermine the empire from within. Then, there are the financiers. Wealthy bankers and banking houses based outside Russia, in Western Europe and America, are often named among the hidden sponsors of revolutionary activity. Olof Aschberg, head of the Swedish bank Nya Banken, is frequently referenced. Some sources describe him as the Bolshevik banker, claiming he supplied funds to support radical publications and even early units of the future Revolutionary Army. Others point to Jacob Schiff of New York's firm Kuhn, Loeb & Co. as an influential external backer. Some contemporary and later claims argue that Schiff provided substantial sums to exiled revolutionaries and helped funnel funds into Russia, enabling the printing of pamphlets, propaganda, and the financing of underground networks. These shadowy actors did not create the revolution outright. Russia was still rotting from internal rot, inequality, political stagnation, and imperial decay. But they accelerated it. By providing money, resources, and ideological infrastructure, they turned unrest into organized rebellion, whispered dissent into revolutionary roar. If Nicholas II had embraced genuine reform, constitutional transformation, empowerment of civic institutions, and root-level societal healing, the lure of these outside agitators would have been drastically weakened. With trust restored between the throne and the people, there would have been far less fertile ground for foreign financiers or radical agitators to sow discord. His refusal wasn't just a political failure, it was a moral and strategic collapse, one that handed the keys to Russia's future to the shadows. His hesitation cracked the foundation. His inaction gave the vultures room to build nests. And in the end, even he came to understand the bitter truth too late. The empire wasn't overthrown by force alone. It was betrayed from within, empowered by money, foreign intrigue, and ideological corruption. What follows is the emotional core of this story, the tragedy not only of a fallen empire, but of what might have been, if one man had confronted not only the rebels at the gates, but the wolves circling outside. In his final days, imprisoned in the dim, suffocating rooms of Yekaterinburg, Nicholas II wrote letters heavy with regret. The ink traced the outline of a mind finally awake to the consequences of inaction. He acknowledged mistakes he had refused to confront for decades, seeing the storm with a clarity that had eluded him in the halls of the Winter Palace. For the first time, he understood the one choice that could have changed everything. He saw how a single act of courage, a single embrace of reform, could have united moderates, preserved the monarchy, and spared millions from death. He understood how the churches, symbols of Russia's enduring faith, like the Kazan Cathedral in St. Petersburg and countless smaller parish churches, had been burned, looted, and desecrated in the chaos he failed to prevent. He saw the slaughter of allies, loyal military officers, and intellectuals who might have preserved the empire, cut down in the streets, in prisons, or on the orders of revolutionary tribunals. Even Rasputin, whose manipulation had poisoned both the court and public trust, had been assassinated, a symbolic gesture that could not undo decades of decay. Every loss weighed on Nicholas like chains: the empire, the crown, the people he could not protect. And soon, his own life would be extinguished, along with those of his family, in a brutal act that left the last Romanovs as martyrs of indecision. History, he now understood, is a long echo of moments seized and moments lost. His hesitation, his fear, and his blindness had allowed forces both foreign and domestic to converge, creating a catastrophe that no letter, no regret could ever undo. The empire he might have saved lay in ashes. And in those ashes, the world glimpsed what might have been, an alternate history of hope, peace, and lives spared, now forever beyond reach. If you want more dark, cinematic alternate histories, the real scandals, betrayals, and murders that shaped our world, hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. In upcoming videos, we'll dive even deeper into the shadows of the Bolshevik era, uncovering the terrifying atrocities, forced labor, famine, and the horrifying accounts of cannibalism that history often buries. We'll examine the human cost of ideology and power and reveal the secrets behind the revolutions that reshaped entire nations. And when you're ready to go further into the darkness, watch the next video appearing on your screen now. Because history is not dead. It's only waiting to be uncovered. Your journey into the forgotten, the forbidden, and the fearsome corners of the past starts here. Don't miss it.